Hello, everyone. My name is James, and today I'm going to be playing for you guys the Lord of the Rings trading card game tutorial. This was released as a part of the starter set for the Two Towers set for the card game, and the Lord of the Rings trading card game was released from 2001 to 2007, um, and they were coming out as the movies were. Um, I had played this at one point as a kid, this particular tutorial, and it had like ways where you can just play the AI as much as you wanted to. So it's going to go ahead and fire this up. Let's keep in mind this game actually is no longer in print, but you can actually still find some sealed cards around the internet in a lot of places. It's just a black screen. Oh, here we go.
Welcome. The Lord of the Rings trading card game is a great way to experience the excitement and adventure of J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth. In it, you recreate the quest of Frodo the Ring-Bearer and his companions as they journey across Middle-earth. In this interactive tutorial, we'll show you how to set up a game and introduce you to the basic rules and mechanics. Let's get started.
And this was again a tie-in to the Two Towers, so this was actually fairly early in the game's life cycle.
In the Lord of the Rings TCG, you and your opponent will take turns, alternately being the Free Peoples player and the Shadow player. Your goal is to move your fellowship to the end of the adventure path while battling your opponent's minions. You will use your minions to thwart your opponent's fellowship. Before playing, each player constructs and brings a deck of cards from the Lord of the Rings TCG. The main deck that you put together is called the Draw Deck. It must contain at least 60 cards and must have equal amounts of Free Peoples cards and Shadow cards. Notice the different symbols in the upper left corner of these cards. Free Peoples cards have a circle, while Shadow cards have a diamond. Also be aware that the cards are divided into several different cultures, representing the various races and factions of Middle-earth, such as Rohan and Isengard. These cultures are represented by icons in the upper right corner of the card. Cards are also organized by type. The characters of the game are companions, allies, and minions. They represent the heroes and villains of Middle-earth. Possessions are swords, armor, mounts, and other helpful items. Events are one-time occurrences that are played from hand, and conditions represent more permanent effects. The final type of cards are sites. These cards represent different locations in Middle-earth and are used to form the adventure path that your characters will travel during the game. We'll talk more about them in a moment. For this tutorial, we'll use the pre-constructed Theoden and Aragorn starter decks from the Two Towers set. In addition to the draw deck, each player also brings an adventure deck to the game. The adventure deck is a pre-selected set of 9 sight cards that represent the adventure path of your characters in their journey.
I think in the later sets they kind of got rid of this mechanic here for the sites, but
The last 2 cards that a player needs are the One Ring and Frodo the Ring-Bearer. Now that you know what needs to be done before a game, let's talk about how the game is won. There are 3 ways to win the Lord of the Rings TCG. The first is by being the first player to win the race to get their ring bearer safely through all 9 sites of the adventure path. The second 2 ways of winning are by stopping your opponent's ring bearer, either by killing him or by corrupting him with the burden of carrying the One Ring.
okay.
Take a look at Frodo again. The number in the shield represents his strength in combat. The number in the red circle represents his vitality, or how many wounds he can take before he dies. A character dies when he takes as many wounds as he has vitality, or when he is overwhelmed in a skirmish.
Just a note, side note, I do apologize that this isn't full screen. This is literally from 2003.
Now that you know how to win the game, the rest will fall into place. Let's get underway with an actual game. For the tutorial, you'll be going first and will be using the Theoden starter deck, while your opponent will use the Aragorn starter deck. The draw decks have been shuffled, and it's time for you and your opponent to play your copies of Frodo and the One Ring. Now the first site of the adventure path is played from the starting player's adventure deck. You've played Horse Country as your Site 1. This is the start of your Fellowship's journey and is where we'll place your player markers. You'll use the green marker and your opponent will use the blue one. Now each player selects a starting fellowship of companions who will accompany Frodo on his quest. Here are the companions in your draw deck. To start, choose Éowyn by clicking on her card. Her twilight cost is 2. We'd also like to have Éomer's strength in the fellowship, but his twilight cost is 3, and we've already used 2 twilight for Éowyn. However, Éomer has some game text that we should look at. His card says that his twilight cost is -1, while you can spot another Rohan man. Spotting simply means that you can see an active card that meets the requirements. Go ahead and click on Éomer to add him to the fellowship, and then click the Done button in the phase dialog box to the left. Your opponent has decided to start with Legolas and Gimli as Frodo's companions. Both players now draw their initial hands of 8 cards. Do so now by clicking on your draw deck. Now we're ready for your first turn. The action begins. Starting with the Fellowship phase, there are 7 phases to a turn. We'll talk about each one as we reach it. In the Fellowship phase, you as the Free Peoples player may play companions, possessions, and other Free Peoples cards to help bolster the strength of your fellowship. Notice the 2 dark tokens that appeared on the right side of the screen when you played the Rider. This part of the play area is known as the Twilight Pool. When you play a Free Peoples card, you add tokens to the Twilight Pool equal to that card's Twilight cost. Your opponent will make use of these tokens to play her shadow cards in the Shadow phase, which is coming up next. The more tokens you put in the Twilight Pool, the more minions and other cards your opponent will be able to play. Note that you can move the tokens around, and that hovering the mouse over them will give you a tooltip displaying how many tokens are in the Twilight Pool. You also have a possession card in your hand called Horse of Rohan, which is a mount. Go ahead and drag the Horse of Rohan onto your Rider of Rohan to play it for a cost of 2 more Twilight tokens. At the end of each Fellowship phase, the Fellowship must move to the next site on the adventure path. Indicate that you are finished playing cards and performing Fellowship actions by clicking Done now. When a player moves to a site that is not yet on the adventure path, the player's opponent plays the new site from their adventure deck. Your opponent has played Rohirrim Village. You must also add tokens to the Twilight Pool each time you move. Notice that the new site has a number in the upper right corner. This is the site's shadow number. In this case, you have to add 3 Twilight tokens to move to the site. We also have to add 1 token for each companion moving to the site. Counting Frodo, you have 4 companions, so we'll add that to the pool as well. You've given your opponent 11 Twilight tokens to play shadow cards with.
Yikes.
Let's see what she can do with it in the Shadow phase. In the Shadow phase, players try to stop their opponent's fellowship by playing minions and shadow support cards. Minions represent the bad guys, the agents of Sauron and Saruman, who are trying to stop the Ringbearer in his quest. Your opponent has just played a Dunlending Brigand. Notice that the Brigand's Twilight cost is 2, but that your opponent removed 4 tokens from the Twilight Pool. In The Lord of the Rings, various minions show up at certain points in the story. This is represented in the Lord of the Rings TCG by the site number. Look at the bottom left corner of the minion's card and notice the compass that matches the one on the site cards. The number inside the compass is that minion's site number. If a minion is played at a site with a number lower than its site number, it is considered to be roaming, and a roaming penalty of 2 Twilight tokens must be paid, in addition to its usual Twilight cost. There are no maneuver actions or cards in these starter decks, and we'll be passing over the maneuver phase without stopping for the rest of the tutorial. But keep an eye on the outline to the left, and you'll be able to keep track of where the maneuver phase fits in. We'll revisit the maneuver phase in the advanced tutorial. None of your companions are archers or have archery actions, and the same goes for your opponent's minions. So we'll move past this phase for now. However, there will be some archery later in the game. Next is the assignment phase. This is where you'll decide which of your companions will be assigned to skirmish each of your opponent's minions. Look at the Dunlending Pillager's game text. When he wins a skirmish, your opponent may discard one of your possessions. You probably don't want to lose your Horse of Rohan, so let's make sure that the Pillager doesn't win his skirmish. Assign Eomer, your strongest companion, to fight him by dragging the Pillager on to Eomer. Good. Now drag the Dunlending Brigand over the Rider of Rohan to assign him to the second skirmish. That's it for the assignment phase, so let's move on to the skirmish phase. The skirmish phase is where the battles between your fellowship and your opponent's minions are fought. There is a skirmish phase for each assignment. The Free People's player chooses the order in which they are resolved. Let's do Eomer's skirmish first. Click on Eomer now. A skirmish is resolved by comparing the total strength of each side. Eomer is currently losing the skirmish and is going to need a little help. To increase Eomer's strength for this skirmish, you'll use a new type of card, an event. Events are one-time use cards that tell you when they can be played. Once played, they are discarded. An honorable charge will increase a companion's strength by 1 for every Rohan man you can spot, with a limit of 3. With Eowyn, Eomer, and the Rider of Rohan in play, you can spot 3 Rohan men. We'll discuss the term unbound in the advanced tutorial. Play the card by dragging it over Eomer. Its twilight cost goes in the pool, and Eomer's strength increases to 10. Your opponent now has an opportunity to play a skirmish action, but has none and passes. Eomer is going to win the skirmish. You could now play another skirmish action if you wanted, but since Eomer is winning the skirmish, there is no need to play anything. When you can't play anything, or you choose not to, you simply pass on your action. Great. Eomer wins the skirmish and the Pillager receives a wound. Since the Pillager only has 1 vitality, he dies and is discarded. An honorable charge is also discarded, as its effect lasts only for the skirmish in which it was used. Now let's resolve the other skirmish. Click the Rider of Rohan to start his skirmish. The Rider of Rohan is losing. The only card in your hand that could possibly help is Work for the Sword, but it will not give the rider enough strength to win the skirmish. Rather than waste the card, go ahead and pass. Your opponent has also passed, so we resolve the skirmish, and since the rider is losing, he receives 1 wound token. That's okay. His vitality is 3, so he's not in immediate danger. Since all skirmishes have been resolved, the Dunlending Brigand is left on the table, and we move on to the regroup phase. During the regroup phase, both players may take any regroup actions or play any regroup cards they may have. Since none of these are available or in play, your opponent, the Shadow player, draws cards until she has 8 cards in hand. This is called reconciling. Now you, as the Free People's player, have a choice to make. You may either move again, or you may stay put and end your turn. There are advantages to moving twice in a turn, but for now let's stop and reconcile your hand. You are allowed to discard 1 card from hand when reconciling, but let's keep them all for now. Go ahead and reconcile your hand by clicking the Reconcile button, or by clicking your draw deck. Notice that when you decided to stay, the surviving minion was discarded and the Twilight Pool emptied. Now it's your first chance to see how being the Shadow player works. Your opponent begins her turn at Site 1 and plays Aragorn for 4 Twilight tokens. That's all that she's chosen to play, so she moves her fellowship to Site 2 and adds 3 Twilight tokens to the pool for the site. She also adds a token for each companion in her fellowship. so you've got 11 tokens with which to play shadow cards. Notice that both of your minions are roaming until Site 5, so that they cost 2 extra Twilight tokens to play. Unfortunately, that means you'll only be able to play one of them during this shadow phase. Double-click the Uruk Defender to play him for a cost of 6 Twilight tokens. There is nothing more that you can afford to play right now, so let's end your shadow phase and see if you can do some damage to your opponent's fellowship. End your shadow phase by clicking Done now. Next is the archery phase, and your opponent has an archer in her fellowship. Your minion is not an archer, so the minion archery total is 0. Legolas has the archer keyword, so he adds 1 to the fellowship archery total. Once archery is totaled, wounds are assigned. Your opponent has decided to assign your minion to Aragorn. She may have some tricks up her sleeve, so let's move to the skirmish phase and find out. As the skirmish begins, your opponent makes use of Gimli's game text, which allows her to exert him to make a companion strength +1. Aragorn's strength is now 9. When an action calls for an exertion, add a wound token to the character in question unless that character is exhausted. Okay, now Aragorn's strength is equal to your minion's strength. In the event of a tie in strength, the shadow side always wins. So at this point your minion is still winning the skirmish and is going to wound Aragorn. Since you don't have to play a skirmish action to win the skirmish, click Pass and let's see what your opponent does. Now your opponent has exerted Legolas to make your minion strength 8. Go ahead and check Legolas's game text in the zoom window, and then let's see what we can do about this. In your hand you have a shadow skirmish event called Ferocity. It will make your minion strength 10, and he will once again be winning the skirmish. Apparently your opponent doesn't want to continue exerting Gimli and Legolas, and has no other action to help out Aragorn. She has passed, and you're winning the skirmish. So click Pass and let's resolve the skirmish. Notice that Aragorn took 2 wounds from losing that skirmish. Why is that? Look at your minion's text and notice that he is damage +1. This is called a damage bonus, and is added on top of the wound that the character would normally inflict. Good job. We're back to the regroup phase, and it's time to reconcile your hand. Once again, you should keep all the cards that you have and simply draw back to 8 cards. Your opponent has decided to move again, so she does not reconcile her hand. Since Site 3 has not been played yet, you will play it from your adventure deck.
So you have chosen death.
When a player moves more than once in a turn, they do not get another fellowship phase. All of the other game phases are repeated, however, and any surviving minions chase the fellowship to the new site. Furthermore, the Twilight Pool is not emptied when a player moves again. So after your opponent has moved and added Twilight tokens for the site and for the number of companions in her fellowship, you have 10 Twilight tokens to use in your Shadow phase. With the extra Twilight, you can play a second minion. Double-click the Uruk Fanatic to play him now. That's all that you can afford to do for now. Click Done to end your Shadow phase and move on to the Archery phase. Again, neither of you have any cards with archery actions, and the minion archery total is still 0. The Fellowship archery total is 1 because Legolas is an archer, so you'll need to assign 1 wound. Good. You now have 2 threats in play. Let's move on to the assignment phase. Your opponent has made her assignments. She has put the Uruk Fanatic up against Frodo and the Uruk Defender on Gimli. Your opponent has decided to resolve Frodo's skirmish first. At the moment, Frodo is not just losing the skirmish, he is being overwhelmed. A character is overwhelmed when the strength of its opponent is twice as much as its own. When a character is overwhelmed at the end of a skirmish, it is killed instantly, regardless of its vitality. Your opponent must have something up her sleeve to save her ring bearer.
I hope so, or else this would end pretty quick.
Yes, your opponent has just played swiftly and softly. Sneaky little hobbit. This is a stealth event that allows a player to cancel a skirmish at sites 1 through 5. There is now no skirmish, and Frodo is saved. However, your minion stays on the table. Now Gimli's skirmish must be resolved. This is a desperate situation for your opponent. The Uruk defender is damage +1, and Gimli has a vitality of 3, but is already wounded. If he loses this skirmish, he'll die. Your opponent has exerted Legolas to make your Uruk defender's strength 7. Legolas is now exhausted, which means that he is 1 wound away from dying, and may no longer be exerted. Gimli is still losing the skirmish, so you should pass. Best Company is a dwarf event that makes Gimli's strength +2. His strength is now 8, and he's winning the skirmish. You have another ferocity in your hand that you could play to regain the upper hand. Drag it over the Uruk defender to play it. Your Uruk defender's strength is now 9, and he is once again winning the skirmish. Apparently your opponent is all out of options. She has passed, and it looks like Gimli is headed for defeat. Go ahead and click pass, and let's resolve the skirmish. Gimli takes 2 wounds for a total of 3. He only has a vitality of 3, so these wounds are enough to kill him. When a companion is killed, it is not discarded, but is instead placed in the dead pile. Remember that Gimli is a unique companion. When a unique companion is in a player's dead pile, that player may not play new copies of that companion to their fellowship. Okay, it's time for the regroup phase. Click on your draw deck to reconcile your hand. You're back at Site 2, getting ready to move to 3. But first let's give your fellowship a bit more help. First, toughen Frodo up by giving him a hobbit sword. Drag it from your hand to his card now. Also play the heavy chain in your hand on the Rider of Rohan. Good. Now let's give Éomer a mount. Each of those cards costs 1 Twilight token, so there are currently 3 tokens in the Twilight pool. That's all you can do for your fellowship phase, so it's time to move on. Click Done to end your fellowship phase and move to Site 3. You have to add 1 token for the site shadow number and 4 for your companions, so there is a total of 8 tokens in the Twilight pool. In her shadow phase, your opponent has played a Dunlending Madman and a Dunlending Robber, for a total of 5 Twilight tokens. Also notice that these Dunlendings have a keyword that you haven't seen yet. Their game text says that if they win a skirmish, they become fierce. Fierce minions get to fight a second time at the same site. Your opponent is done playing shadow cards, and we're ready to move to the archery phase. You still do not have any archers in your fellowship, and neither of the minions is an archer. So we'll skip the archery phase and move on to the assignment phase. Assigning the minions to Éomer and Éowyn gives your strongest companions a chance to beat the minions and keep them from becoming fierce. Assign the Dunlending Madman to Éowyn now. And now assign the Dunlending Robber to Éomer. Good. Now it's the skirmish phase. Let's resolve Éowyn's skirmish first. Click on Éowyn to start the skirmish. Éowyn needs some help to beat this minion. Remember, the Free Peoples player always takes the first action in a phase, so play Work for the Sword on Éowyn now by dragging it over her. Work for the Sword is a Rohan event that costs 1, but increases a Rohan man's strength by 2. Éowyn's strength is now 8, and she is winning the skirmish. Your opponent has passed on her skirmish action, and Éowyn is stronger than the Dunlending Madman, so click Pass and we'll resolve the skirmish. Good. Éowyn wins the skirmish and the Dunlending Madman receives 1 wound, which kills him. Now let's move on to Éomer's skirmish. Click on Éomer to start the skirmish. Éomer also needs a bit of help. Play an honorable charge to make Éomer's strength 10. It is now your opponent's action, and she has countered your event with 1 of her own. Dark Fury makes the robber's strength 13, because your fellowship is currently at a sanctuary, indicated by the gray border around the site and the sanctuary keyword. Sanctuaries have special healing powers that trigger when you start your turn there. We'll discuss this in more detail next turn. It is now your action. But you have no cards in hand that will help Éomer win the battle. You have no choice but to pass on your skirmish action. Éomer receives 1 wound from the Dunlending robber, who now becomes fierce and has a strength of 11. When a minion is fierce, it may be reassigned to a different companion, but in this case it's best to reassign the Dunlending robber to Éomer. Do so now. Now there is another skirmish phase to resolve. Again, you have no skirmish actions to play, so go ahead and click Pass, and let's see if your opponent has any skirmish actions. Your opponent has also passed, and the Dunlending robber wins the skirmish, giving Éomer another wound. He is now exhausted. Some actions take place at the start of a turn rather than in a phase. Healing at a sanctuary is such an action. In her fellowship phase, your opponent has played a Hobbit sword on Frodo and is now ready to move. Your Site 4 is West Emnet Hills, which has a shadow number of 3. Add in your opponent's 3 companions, and you've got 7 tokens in the Twilight Pool. It's your shadow phase, so play the Orthanc warrior from your hand. Now that your minion has been strengthened by the broad-bladed sword, end your shadow phase by clicking Done. In the archery phase, you would normally take a wound from Legolas, but notice that the game text of the broad-bladed sword prevents all wounds except in skirmishes. Your Orthanc warrior comes through unscathed and ready for battle. Your opponent has assigned the warrior to Aragorn, her strongest companion. Let's see if you can do some damage in the skirmish phase. Aragorn's strength is 8, and your opponent has exerted Legolas to make the warrior's strength 8 as well, so the 2 are currently tied. Remember that ties always go to the shadow side, so your minion is still winning the skirmish. Pass on this skirmish action, and let's see what happens. Your opponent has exerted Legolas a second time, and your Orthanc warrior is now losing the skirmish. However, Legolas is now exhausted, and you've got a copy of Ferocity in your hand. Playing Ferocity will give your minion a +2 to his strength, and he'll regain the upper hand. Play it now by dragging it over the Orthanc warrior. Your opponent cannot exert Legolas again and is forced to pass. If you pass now, you'll win the skirmish and wound Aragorn twice. We've reached the regroup phase, and you may reconcile your hand by clicking on your draw deck. After taking 2 wounds, your opponent has decided to stop instead of moving on to Site 5, so it is now your turn. Up until now, you have not used any of the site's game text. However, notice the text of Throne Room. It says that you may play Theoden from your draw deck during your fellowship phase. You are about to head into dangerous territory, so it would be a good idea to have some extra companions in your fellowship. Now play Theoden's sword Herogrim on him and Heavy Chain on Éowyn. Also notice that the Rider of Rohan is not a unique companion, so you may play a second one to your fellowship. Do so now by double-clicking the Rider in your hand. It's time to move on to Site 4 and see what your opponent has in store for you. Ouch! In her shadow phase, your opponent has played 4 minions. You have no archers in your fellowship, and none of the minions are archers. So let's skip the archery phase and move on to the assignment phase. 2 of these minions could become fierce if they win their skirmishes. So let's try and keep that from happening. Assign the robber to Theoden, as he's currently your strongest companion, and he stands the best chance of defeating the robber. Now assign the madman to Éomer, your second strongest companion. That covers the 2 minions that could become fierce if they win their skirmishes. You assign them to your strongest companions, hoping that you could defeat them and prevent them from doing more damage as fierce minions. Next, assign the Dunlending Savage to your first Rider of Rohan. Okay, now assign the Dunlending Brigand to the remaining Rider of Rohan. That's it for assignments. It's time to resolve the skirmishes in the skirmish phase. Let's resolve Éomer's skirmish first. Click on him to start the skirmish. Éomer is losing the skirmish, but you have an event in hand that will help him out. Play an honorable charge on Éomer to give him enough strength to beat the Dunlending Madman. Great. Your opponent has passed, and the Madman is losing the skirmish. Once you pass, he'll take 1 wound, which will kill him. Next we'll resolve Theoden's skirmish. Click on him to start the skirmish. Theoden is also losing his skirmish, but work for the sword will make Theoden's strength 10, which will beat the robber. Play it now by dragging it over Theoden. Again, your opponent has passed, so if you pass, Theoden will win the skirmish. With Herogrim, Theoden is damage +1, so he inflicts 2 wounds, which is more than enough to kill the Dunlending robber. Now it's your rider's turn to fight. Click on the Rider of Rohan that's assigned to the Dunlending Brigand to start his skirmish. The rider's strength of 5 is no match for the brigand's 8, so he is probably going to lose the skirmish and take a wound. You have no cards to help him out, so go ahead and click Pass now. Ouch! Your opponent has played Death to the Strawheads. This card makes a Dunlending man strength +1 for every companion your opponent can spot. When a non-unique companion dies, they are still placed in the dead pile, but you are allowed to play new copies of them should you draw more. There is one last skirmish to resolve with your other Rider of Rohan. Normally, the Dunlending Savage's 11 strength would overwhelm the rider, but look at the text of the rider's heavy chain. Now that we're in the regroup phase, you have to decide if you want to move again. If you stay here, your opponent will have to face your Site 5, which should allow you to do some more damage to her fellowship. To start her turn, your opponent has played a Ranger's Sword on Aragorn for a cost of 1 Twilight token. Now she has discarded a copy of Aragorn from her hand to heal Aragorn. She's now ready to move and needs your Site 5. Play it now by clicking on your adventure deck. Good. Deep of Helm is really going to help you out in the Shadow phase. Your opponent has ended her Fellowship phase, so let's move on. After moving, your opponent has given you 10 Twilight tokens to spend. That's not a whole lot, but look at the text of Site 5, Deep of Helm. The cost of the first Uruk-hai you play at this site will be -3. Not only that, but your Uruk-hai are no longer roaming at Site 5. With the site's text in mind, play your Uruk Regular now by double-clicking on him. The Uruk Regular would normally cost 3 tokens, but is free to play because of the game text on the site. Now play your Uruk Stalker and Uruk Rear Guard. That's all you can play in the Shadow phase, but you should be able to do some serious damage with these minions. Now we're in the Archery phase, and the Fellowship Archery total is still 1 because of Legolas, so assign the wound to the Uruk Regular by clicking on him. Your opponent has 3 companions, and you've played 3 minions. That means that Frodo will have to be involved in a skirmish, and you may be able to do some damage to the Ringbearer. The Uruk Stalker has been assigned to Frodo, the Uruk Regular to Legolas, and the Uruk Rear Guard to Aragorn. We'll proceed to a skirmish phase for each of these assignments. Your opponent wants to resolve Aragorn's skirmish first, so let's take a closer look at that matchup. With his sword, Aragorn gets a +2 bonus to his strength against all minions. But while fighting an Uruk-hai, the sword's game text gives him an additional +2 bonus. So Aragorn's strength is +4, making it 12, which is tied with the Uruk Rear Guard's strength. The Uruk Rear Guard will win the skirmish if the strength remains tied at the end of the skirmish. Your opponent must not have any skirmish actions to help Aragorn out. She has passed, and it's now your skirmish action. Since your minion is currently winning the skirmish, go ahead and pass on your skirmish action. The Uruk rear guard wins the skirmish, and Aragorn takes 2 wounds. He now has 3 wounds and is exhausted. Now your opponent has decided to resolve Legolas's skirmish. Your opponent has played Valor to boost Legolas's strength to 9. Losing this skirmish will kill your minion, but Still They Came may come in handy against Frodo, so pass on this skirmish action by clicking Pass now. The Uruk regular receives a wound token which is enough to kill him. That's okay. The important skirmish is coming up next. Frodo's strength is 6 and the Uruk Stalker is 8. If you can get the Uruk Stalker's strength up to 12, you'll be able to overwhelm Frodo. You may exert the Uruk rear guard to play Still They Came. This will give the Uruk Stalker strength of 11, so go ahead and do that now. First drag Still They Came onto the Uruk Stalker. Now you're only 1 strength away from overwhelming Frodo, and your opponent doesn't appear to have anything to help her ring bearer out. Look at the Uruk rearguard's text. You can exert him to make the Stalker's strength +1. Do so now by choosing the skirmish option from the drop-down menu. Great. The Stalker is now overwhelming Frodo, and your opponent has passed again. All that's left is for you to choose to pass on your skirmish action. Good job. Frodo's strength is doubled. He is overwhelmed, and you've won the game by defeating your opponent's fellowship. Now that you have had a run-through of the basic rules and mechanics of the Lord of the Rings trading card game, head back to the main menu and play a few advanced tutorial games to learn about some more concepts and rules.